Hey, Bear Creek. Good to have you here. I've got Sam Tsang, Dr. Sam Tsang, with us. He is the author of our book that we're studying for Lent, and I'm so thankful to have you here. Thanks for doing this, Sam.
Well, thank you for having me. It's my privilege.
All right. Well, it's a privilege for us too. I just wanted to people know a little bit about you, but will you just kind of share kind of a little bit of your story? How you got to where you are now as this New Testament scholar?
Well, I was born in Hong Kong. I was raised in the U.S. I've been here since, 50 some odd years ago.
Hmm.
So they'll probably date me for my age. So I was here as a little kid, and pretty much, I'm as American as American. But people still see me as multicultural and whatever.
Totally.
My original training was in architecture. So I studied architecture. I worked as someone in the field in architecture for a little while, in construction as well.
Sure.
And then I went into seminary for ministry, and then whatever leads me to my present situation.
And if I'm not mistaken, not just America or U.S., but Florida. That's where you kind of grew up, right?
Yes, I grew up in Florida.
Interesting place to grow up. And what got you excited about the New Testament? I mean, moving from architecture to New Testament.
I think in seminary, I actually got pretty excited about theology, and especially historical theology. And those are my best classes. I got the best grades in those classes and so on.
Unlike me.
We're a bit opposite, aren't we?
We are a little bit. That's a good thing.
My professors all wanted me to go to Germany to get my PhD in theology.
Sure.
But I always found the Word of God to be so centered in my life, right?
Right.
And that I just chose to do New Testament instead of theology. And I thought I did okay.
Yeah. And you've written quite extensively on it. How many books have you written?
50 odd, including Chinese books.
Wow. Just amazing. And it seems like your passion is to help preachers, homiletics or preachers, but also to help lay people understand maybe a different way to read the Bible. And you talk about it in your book, this idea of not reading the Bible in a flat understanding of the Bible. Can you just kind of share what that means?
Sure. I think most of us read the Bible through our own experiences, which is not always bad, because we as human beings, we experience life very similarly, whether we're ancient people or modern people. But I think also we have to understand the distance between our modern reader from the text itself. I think there's a need for a critical and healthy historical distance that we should have when we read the Bible, but we often neglect that part.
Sure. And you talk about really three experiences, our own personal, we bring that, which we need to, but then what are the other two kind of scenarios we need to consider?
One scenario, which we sometimes do, especially preachers, would be the experience between Jesus and his listeners or his disciples. So let's say somebody goes up there and preach on Sunday, then he would talk about Jesus' background, why he would say this, and so on. That's that layer. That's a first layer. Most people, if they are more educated, they would read it from that perspective. But one area that I think we've neglected is the original reader and original author and their relationship.
Okay,
Say Matthew.
So Matthew and his audience, which is different than Jesus and Jesus' audience.
Right. Although there's common ground as well.
There's common ground, and probably not as much distance between those two.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
How would you? So I was talking to somebody once, and we were talking about the New Testament, and we were talking about the gospel writers, and they were saying, well, these were simple folk. So we don't want to get too complicated in our reading. And I don't see that in your book. You see them as pretty complex people.
I think in opposition of that, we are simple folks. We are simple folks. I think we underestimate the complexity of ancient culture, their way of thinking, and their language. There's no reason to think of them as simple folks. For example, Matthew's Greek shows a person who knows Greek very well educated. Paul, we don't need to talk more about him.
Totally.
Book of Hebrews, the guy can write in very literary Greek. Luke, absolutely very literary Greek. So these are well-educated people. While other authors might use more simple language, they too gotten witnesses from following Jesus, and they drew from them. So we can't just simply say these are simple folks. I kind of oppose that idea.
Yeah,
I think we're being simplistic when we say that.
Right. So as you write your books for lay people, if there was one thing you'd want them to get out of this book that we're reading, what is it?
I think if they can appreciate the complexity of the ancient audience when they are reading or listening to these stories being told, in particular with Matthew, and then apply to their lives. Don't skip that part. Understand where we are common with the ancient audience. For example, during that time, it's after the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
There's no temple to go to worship. Synagogues were rising up because there are so many synagogues. And Matthew's audience are Jews. They were living they're worshiping in synagogue, they're living a Jewish lifestyle, which is nothing wrong because that's what Jewish people do. Those are important things to consider. And let's say Nero's dynasty has already passed. Now we got a new dynasty in Roman Empire. And that empire will have a relationship with the Jews, for example.
Totally.
How is that relationship being played out? And that's important for the audience because they are facing those political circumstances. And it is through those circumstances that they are reading or listening to Matthew's stories. It's very little wonder Matthew portrays Rome in a certain way. It's very little wonder that Matthew portrayed Jesus in a certain way. That's in a political way.
Right.
Because there's a political model of Jesus and there's the worldly model of everything else around the Roman Empire. These are things that we don't think about.
In just reading your book, one of the things I was fascinated by was the complex nature of what was going on there. And not every Jew approached the Roman Empire the same way. There was a myriad of ways that they were trying to approach this. And Matthew had one way of approaching it, or maybe a couple, and that might be different for instance, of how Luke was trying to approach that regime. Or you also talk in your book, or we just talked recently right before this, about when you read the Gospels or Matthew in a flat way, you may come across almost like anti-Jewish. You might read it that way, and that is not the way that Matthew was trying to write this. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yes, I can. I think I appreciate what you just said about how people read it flat, because the church in its history is very anti-Jewish.
Yeah, totally.
And that's how the Holocaust became an event, right? So what you were saying is during that time, people are very diverse in their way of thinking, right? So I think that's an important aspect to think about, because in the church, we normally would say things like, well, Jewish people in that time thought like this, something like that, right? But is that really true? Is that true of every single Jewish person? I would say definitely not. And when we simplify things like that, we are reading the Bible in an anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic way and doing great harm. But because we lack the historical information, or we don't study history enough, right? The church in general doesn't study the history of first century. Neither do a lot of preachers, right? So adding all that together, I'm not speaking about you, but if you think about adding all that together, we are all guilty to a certain extent of this anti-Jewish reading.
Yeah.
But what Jesus has brought in, and what I'm trying to bring in this book, is during the first century, when Matthew was writing, there are many different ways of looking at the world by those people. Probably, I'm writing in a limited way. There are many, many more ways. But by putting Jesus in as one way and all these other ones as other ways, you get to see how Jesus is different and how Jesus is similar.
Mm.
So a lot of times we think of Jesus as just being a subversive person. No, sometimes
Right.
Jesus borrows from his culture
Mm-hmm.
and being similar as well. Now, how are we navigating those waters is important for Christians because we are descendants of Judaism. Whether we like it or not, we came from
Totally.
Judaism. Jesus
Exactly.
was a Jew. He was not a Christian,
Right.
right? So when we miss those pieces, we miss pieces of Christianity. And that's great harm to our faith as well.
Yeah. And as well, Jesus is navigating, right, through a very complex political system, trying to figure out how to, change that reality, but also try to, I don't know, stay alive in some senses. I mean, he's working through that, and I think it's really important for us to see that too, right? How masterful he is at that at some times, and when he picks and chooses to make his big points. Now, let's go a little bit now to the parables, which is this book is about the parables in Matthew. Could you describe to us what a parable is?
Well, the easiest way to describe a parable is it's a storytelling of an analogy. Storytelling of an analogy. So Jesus is trying to make some major point, sometimes just one point, sometimes multiple points, or one point with several subpoints and so on. But he makes it very clear what those points are usually. And when it's not clear to us, it's because we're not navigating it through the original reader's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
So we miss it, right? Mm-hmm. But that's what a parable is.
And that's what you're trying to do then when we go, what you say, reading the parable backwards or offering this alternative parable. You're trying to get us to understand what that culture at that time one way that they might have told that story normally in their culture. Can you just describe that a little bit more for us? Because what it means to read a parable backwards or to have this alternative that you bring out.
Okay. I think there are some steps that we can take to come up with our own reading paradigm. The first step is to just read more about first century history or read more first century history to understand how people thought. I think that's a piece that Christians
where do you get that? First century history.
There are books written on it, obviously, right?
Yeah.
And if you really want to read...
is there one particularly?
I read Josephus, who
right.
led the Jerusalem rebellion, and he wrote the history of the Jews, the antiquities of the Jews. In reading Josephus, you'll see how he interprets the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. He was a trained Pharisee, very well learned, extremely difficult Greek because he's a learned man. So Josephus would be one place, but you would find reading Josephus there are a lot of things that just seem very unfamiliar. Right? Most Christians just give up and say, "Yeah, I don't want to read it. It's too much." But right now you have Wikipedia. You have all these tools online, DeepSeek or whatever, OpenAI, where you can find information on the stuff that you don't understand when you're reading a book like that. Why be that lazy? You have no excuse, right? So that's the first piece I would say, right? That we need
say
to
that
have.
again. Why be that lazy? It's
Right.
hard work. We need to do the work. Right?
Faith is not easy work. Okay, knowing Jesus, getting to know Jesus and becoming a Christian is easy, but the rest of it should be hard work. So that's a piece that we have to get right before we can formulate, say, oh, what stories could there be when Jesus is telling this story, right? And that's one piece that we have to think about that I think is missing a lot. Even in seminary, they're not making students read Josephus anymore, unless I'm teaching them. Then they'll be hurting. But I don't think I've ever met too many students who regretted reading Josephus
and getting to know that first century, what was going on, because that's when it's all written.
And I'm there to guide them, obviously,
right.
and to give them ideas of why he wrote in this way.
Right.
So that's an important piece. We're talking about creativity in reading Matthew, right? You and I had those conversations. Yeah. Creativity has to be informed by good information.
Yeah.
So you have to have that piece in before you can read it creatively.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we could have read lots of our own narratives, because we have lots of narratives now in our modern world, that may not even fit in Matthew's world.
Right.
So I think there has to be some limitations, some boundaries when we read.
Informed creativity.
Yes, informed, because God's a God of history.
Yeah, right.
We have to understand the history that
Totally.
God has worked in first century, for example.
Right. So you, being an informed reader, then write these imaginative parables that are different than Jesus. What's the point of those?
The point is, I think we have to look at Jesus and Matthew as part of the greater conversation that's going on in Judaism. When we're honestly reading them as Jews, we have to say they are conversing in a culture. Just like right now, if we write a book, the language we use, the situations that we talk about would fit in our culture, right? But that's not the only way to look at our culture.
Yeah.
But we present one way, right? As in conversation with these other ways.
Right.
Whether deliberately or not, we are in conversation with the culture. So was Jesus, so was Matthew. And I think a lot of times we, as Christian readers, we miss that piece, especially Matthew and his original audience.
We kind of, from my understanding too, there's hinge points in Jesus' parables where he may subvert the normal or the backward story, so to speak, or augment. And when we don't understand that backward story, there's no way we can see the hinge or what Jesus is trying to do. You know, his subtlety or his sometimes not subtlety, where he's just kind of putting it out there. What would you say Jesus? Let me give you an example of one way I've understood Jesus and maybe the parables in this sense. I had a gal in my one of our college ministries that saw Jesus as the stirring stick. You know, like in coffee, Jesus would stir things up, and that stick would, so you would think differently. And kind of a parable similar, right? Stirring it up a bit, or am I wrong?
I think, yes, Jesus did stir up a lot of things. And also, but Jesus also was a product of his culture. He cannot possibly minister without being part of that culture.
Yeah.
I think the interesting reading is when we see the two opposing reading. The one way of reading Jesus is that Jesus is completely in his culture, and everything he says is the norm of the culture.
Right.
That tends to be more of a evangelical reading. And there's the other reading that's more lean towards non-evangelical, or sometimes people call him liberal. Liberal reading Jesus as a revolutionary, that Jesus stirred everything. I think we have to find some middle point between the two. Because Jesus is Jesus. Jesus is not this guy or that guy. Jesus is not Republican or Democrat. Jesus is Jesus. You know, Jesus cannot be contemporized in such a way that
we try to simplify.
Hijack it,
we try to hijack or simplify.
So I think we have to keep that intention, right? Keep that intention. And the more we're informed about Jesus' culture, I think the better we can keep these things in tension and try to get at the true Jesus.
True Jesus, and also
what he taught.
Realizing Matthew's understanding
and Matthew's
of Jesus,
understanding of Jesus.
Yeah. Which is different than Luke's, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. But you have another book about Luke's parables.
Yes,
so
I
that's
do.
great. All right. So as I'm thinking about those who are listening to this today, and they're thinking about this hole possibly in their understanding of the Gospels, especially that first century awareness. What kind of encouragement might you give them as they struggle through that part? Because I think that's the part they still want to skip, if that makes sense. You've made your point well, but how would you encourage us to keep going in that area?
Well, besides saying that faith is hard work, I would say, we spend a lot of our energy developing ourselves professionally or getting a good career. I think many people in our congregation are very, very successful people. A lot of times I think Christians are kingdom citizens in name only, right?
Oh, you did mention this in your book.
Yeah.
Yes, totally.
We don't want to do the hard work in our faith. But we want to do hard work in everything else. We'll put in overtime. We'll try to rise up in our corporate world and our tech companies and so on. But sometimes we miss the most important thing, which is our faith. And when we don't work at it, you know, we have lots of choices when it comes to leisure, right? We can watch Netflix, we can do all these things. And nothing's wrong with any of those things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Christians live a very distracted life. And as a result of that distraction, we become lazy in our faith.
Mm.
And I would encourage everyone to take their faith a little more seriously. You know, read one difficult book, not just a you know, chicken soup for the soul kind of book, but one difficult book a year.
Okay.
You know, whether it's theological or based on the New Testament, Old Testament, read something difficult and try to navigate through it as a spiritual exercise, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a spiritual exercise. Because as you grow in your intellect, I think you would also grow spiritually. You know, we can't neglect the mind, or like that book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind by Mark Knoll, right?
Right.
That really hits home when we were in seminary. We went to seminary similar period. So it's still going on.
Yeah.
What is evangelical and non-evangelical? I think we need to take our faith seriously.
So when you become a better thinking Christian, do you think then we become closer in our understanding of what Jesus really was trying to say and do, and therefore we can change society, or we can make an impact in the world in a different way?
Well, I think that's part of it, isn't it? I think we can do many well-intentioned things, even accidentally, and benefit lots of people in the name of God. I think it's great. But we got to look at the other side of things. Sometimes we can do things uninformed and cause great harm with great intentions.
Right.
Christians don't think about that.
Yeah.
Maybe until afterwards, until the aftermath hit and say, that's no good, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the brain's important. It has to be in there somewhere.
Yeah. All right. Well, any final? Thank you. This has been very informative. And is there something just to finish this off? Well, anything else, or are we pretty good?
I feel pretty good about what we said. I think, you know, at the end of the day, love God, love people, but use your mind properly when you do so, so that you can truly live according to the spirit that Jesus has taught us.
And what I hear, you know, in the United Methodist Church, we have this 3 simple rules: do no harm, do all the good you can, and stay in love with God. The mind is a big part of that. And you just mentioned, sometimes if we don't do the mind work, we can do harmful things in the world. And that, especially that example with our understanding of the Jewish faith in the past. Hopefully we can continue to help do some good in that area particularly. So, all right. Well, thank you, Sam. I so much appreciate your being with us. And wow, this is a great privilege for us. Thank you.
Thank you. And see you in worship.
Yes.